up falling behind from a geopolitical perspective.
I'm more worried about the frontier labs self-policing more aggressively than the government ever would and stifling competition that way. I think that's a far scarier future.
How long until we can actually hold the Moonshot Summit on the moon?
Question for you, Peter. How many years of holding this do you think would be required before it could be held on the moon? How much of a moonshot gathering is it on Earth?
Yeah.
We should be holding it on the moon.
I think you're absolutely right. So listen, Starship's making their first landing there in a couple of years, demonetization curve. I think the moonshot's gathering on the moon early 2030s, mid 2030s.
Now we're talking. None of this 20 years from now business from you, right?
I'm doing that especially for you. Yeah, the challenge is that the transportation costs are going to definitely outweigh the ticket cost.
So what I'm hearing you say is moonshot gathering 2032 on the moon?
Oh, man, I don't want to prompt.
What changes when civilian AI quietly leapfrogs the NSA on its own benchmarks?
My sense is everything changed with Mythos. And I have to add the caveat, it appears based on a number of public cybersecurity benchmarks that GPT 5.5, which unlike Claude Mythos is actually generally available, is stronger at these cybersecurity benchmarks. But I think looking back from near future history, so looking back historically, I think we'll view the Mythos moment, if you will, as a sea change when the civilian sector, the frontier AI labs, suddenly had capabilities that leapfrogged government capabilities, where specifically Mythos was suddenly able to, and as Peter, as you and I talk about in Solve Everything, where entire disciplines get solved at once, with the Mythos moment, cybersecurity and in particular vulnerability discovery getting effectively solved, for some definition of solved, by AI for the first time, in the private sector, leapfrogging what possibly the NSA or other government agencies had internally. This was a moment when the government, even an aggressively deregulatory government, an AI-friendly government, as the present administration is, sort of woke up and realized, hey, wait a minute, these are leapfrog capabilities coming from the private sector.
Yeah.
They could lead to vulnerabilities in government systems, vulnerabilities in industrial and SCADA systems throughout the economy, maybe actually some sort of light touch gatekeeping mechanism might actually be merited at this point. So I think without putting my finger on the scale of whether this is actually a good idea or not answering the normative question, I think it's a natural time to at least be answering the question of whether certain advanced capabilities are perhaps in some sense naturally gate-kept by some quasi-governmental entity.
And how new is this whole gatekeep-the-private-sector instinct, really?
There was always a bit of a moat there, even before any new executive orders. I'm thinking in particular of export controls that do regulate the ability for open source or closed source capabilities to be shared with the public. There's the Invention Secrecy Act that's been statutorily on the books for many decades that functions as a sort of gatekeeping for anyone who wants to file a patent application that touches on certain sensitive areas. There's the Atomic Energy Act from the early 1950s that also gatekeeps certain elements of new applied physics. So it's not as if we're suddenly entering some brave new world where the government, this administration or some other administration, suddenly decides that new technologies must be gatekept by government oversight. We've been in that regime arguably since World War II. It's just that AI capabilities coming from the private sector are now so capable, so strong that this government, and probably I would speculate future US governments, may feel a strong need to suddenly step into the loop from a gatekeeping perspective.
So when the moral panic is inevitable, who do you actually want holding it?
And I think it's more to do with compute, though.
GPT-2 and GPT-3, the memory dulls, but those models were also held up purportedly for safety reasons. And now
by Dario.
By Dario when he was at OpenAI. I think there's a long history of a little bit of, call it moral panic over new AI capabilities. Moral panic to some extent as radical new capabilities like vulnerability discovery suddenly come online. It's probably natural on the one hand, and the question, I think a question one could ask is, would you rather the moral panic be held by the frontier labs doing the gatekeeping, or would you rather that it be held by a democratically elected government? Someone somewhere is inevitably going to have this moral panic anytime new capabilities come online.
Which gatekeeper is more dangerous, the elected one or the one with stock options?
Yes. Yeah, I think if anything, if you're asking now for my normative position on this, I'm more worried not that the government is going to too aggressively gatekeep. the models. I'm worried that the frontier labs themselves will so aggressively self-censor for a variety of reasons, whether it's the new models are too compute intensive or they want to leverage the models just for their own commercial benefit and not share them. I'm more worried about the frontier labs self-policing more aggressively than the government ever would and stifling competition that way. I think that's a far scarier future.
What does it look like when frontier labs start having labor problems?
I would just say not only did those, and this has been publicly reported, those Google employees protest, they unionized, which is something we've never seen before. We've never seen in a frontier space like this, AI, just like the juxtaposition of 19th century union-style organization on the one hand with 21st century, this was the British DeepMind employees who were unionizing to protest Google entering into this agreement with the Pentagon. We've never seen this bizarre juxtaposition like this before. I think it's probably not a great look for Google that they have employees unionizing outside the continental U.S., outside the U.S. overall, to protest, working for arguably patriotic purposes with the U.S. military. Not a good look at all. On the other hand, I would say the 7 companies, I think reflection is somewhere in there as well. This at least underlines the upside in my mind, which is there's at least enough competition in the frontier model space that the Department of War has enough other counterparties to go to if it's unwilling or unable to work with Anthropic. Yeah. At least there will be other models available on the CIPRNet and JWIX.
I can't wait for the agents to unionize.
And what if the biggest dark horse in the AI race almost got fired 3 years ago?
Yeah, we're going to see that in just a minute. Alex?
I want to note that Google Cloud had a rather difficult childbirth. Think back a few years to, there was a point at which reportedly the co-founders of Google had passed a mandate for Thomas Kurian. Either Google Cloud had to become number 1 or number 2 public cloud, or it would simply be removed. It would be excised from Alphabet. And that was, I think, a dangerous time, and there were a variety of documents and internal memos regarding the future of GCP getting leaked at the time. And I think Google/Alphabet, to their credit, did sort of stood out, took a stand against those who would rather Google have not stayed in the public cloud race. They carved out Google Cloud as its own line item in quarterly reports just in time for the AI tailwind. And now, thanks to the AI tailwind and exposing both TPUs to their own customers and now TPUs and TPU compute capacity to other frontier labs, also a very good move, arguably. And then maybe even offering TPUs for direct sale to others' data centers. I think Google Cloud not only has a fighting chance, but is arguably, as many others have mentioned, in a unique position from a vertical integration perspective to potentially leapfrog both AWS and Azure. It's an exciting time.
Where does compute scarcity actually flow when even Google has to ration internally?
Yeah, one thing I think most people don't realize is the situation is so severe, and this has been publicly reported, that even within Google, the 3 main compute consumers, which are search, the historic user, comma, cloud, comma, DeepMind, those 3 users on a periodic basis, I think it's been reported once a week or once a month, they all have to fight out new compute capacity that comes online for their respective divisions. I do think this is a preview of the future where what gets prized ultimately, as we spoke about in a previous pod, what gets prized is per token economic productivity. The highest, most revenue generating or most profit generating tokens will ultimately receive the most compute. And we're seeing this now, not just at the inter-frontier lab level. We've spoken in the past about how Anthropic's strategy seems squarely aimed at maximizing dollar value per token. But similarly, even within Google, they're all fighting it out to see who can generate the most dollar value per token. I think that type of liquid market or auctions per token, that's the future we're going to find ourselves in.
Quick callback to Peter's daily reading habit.
Peter, credit where credit is due. You turned my daily newsletter into non-investment investment advice. Bravo.
Oh, my God. We'll get to that in a moment. But, this is what we're seeing. Google's market cap is just within 4% for overtaking NVIDIA. I didn't look today to see if it's closed the gap.
It's still pretty close. I checked.
Why is OpenAI suddenly dating everyone in the data center market?
Remember when Satya made that now infamous comment about how Microsoft was good for their $80 billion? in sort of backhanded reference to not being good for supplying all of the voracious appetite for compute that OpenAI had basically demanded under their prior engagement with Microsoft. I think we're seeing the fallout of that. I think we're seeing OpenAI and Anthropic having voracious compute appetites, and Microsoft, at least a former iteration of Microsoft, call it all of a year ago, thinking that they're being very fiscally responsible by limiting their data center build-out and everything that goes with it, including mega tranches of corporate debt/credit on the data center credit markets, but thinking that they're being responsible. You can sort of trace a line of causality from Microsoft's decision-making at that time to OpenAI today being essentially starved of Microsoft-only compute and needing to diversify beyond even the original concept of Stargate. Remember, Stargate originally was this sort of alliance with Microsoft and then all of Microsoft's suppliers, and then Oracle came into the picture, and then SoftBank came into the picture, and then all of these other suppliers came into the picture, and then Stargate was no longer about OpenAI directly being a single tenant for data centers that they were financing, but instead became a branding moniker for leasing compute from a variety of third-party providers. All of these are connected into a single causal chain, which is that Microsoft and also OpenAI's not-for-profit status, that's part of the story as well, but Microsoft wasn't in a position to supply enough compute for OpenAI's demands, and as a result, that OpenAI-Microsoft marriage has turned into what we saw now, which is OpenAI is dating OpenAI is dating everyone else at this point.
What was the original tangle between OpenAI's nonprofit and Microsoft's money?
Wondering
right now,
there were corporate governance issues. OpenAI was a nonprofit, and they needed to invest in a for-profit, and they created the for-profit subsidiary in part so Microsoft could invest. It was complicated.
What if OpenAI's pre-IPO leak isn't a problem, but a setup?
Well, a few things. One, I think the underlying story here, one of the factors is, as I've mentioned previously, OpenAI was betting on consumer to carry it to its revenue targets, and that turns out to just have been a terrible idea. Consumers don't want to spend lots of money on reasoning tokens. Enterprises do. So pivoting back from consumer to enterprise, which Anthropic, due to its own compute limitations, was betting on enterprise almost the entire time, at least from far earlier on than OpenAI was, that cost them. And that may have, in fact, ultimately delayed their revenue targets for what would have been their IPO. Now they're, as Brian mentioned, GPT 5.5 is out. Codex is looking stronger than Claude Code at the moment. I expect leapfrogging to continue. But that did probably set back OpenAI's internal revenue projections somewhat. At the same time, they're backing out of Stargate as it was originally construed, and now it's just a leasing operation. It's no longer a data center build operation, so that should free them up quite a bit. It's a bizarre situation, though, if Sarah is leaking these expectations. It almost smells to me like an expectation re-anchoring game. Why, if you're about to go public, do you have your CFO leaking these stories to the Wall Street Journal and other major publications that, things might not be as rosy as they otherwise seem, and we might have to delay our IPO? That's the sort of exercise in PR that a company goes through if maybe it's trying to re-anchor expectations lower than they actually are so that it can exceed and beat them on a shorter time scale.
What is the elephant in the room that everyone is too polite to name?
Okay, Alex, and then we'll go back to you, Salim. Go ahead, Alex.
So a hot take, the elephant in the room. How is this money going to be spent? $10 billion OpenAI, $1.5 billion Anthropic. A skeptic, which I'm not, but a skeptic might argue, in this instance I'm not, but a skeptic might argue that there's a very real risk that these monies are going to be used to basically pay the respective frontier labs for their own sales. That it's sort of OpenAI spending $10 billion, or I guess they've contributed part of the $10 billion, but that's ultimately a bit circular. So the same folks who were arguing that all of these deals in the past year or so that NVIDIA was striking with other folks in their supply chain were just constituted NVIDIA doing circular sales. Yes. That OpenAI and Anthropic are basically launching these ventures or co-branded ventures as a way to drive their own sales through circular sales mechanisms and wash sales. That's what a skeptic would say. Another take would be that PE firms, I guess there's a second elephant in this particular room, which is that the PE firms have got to be staring down future discounted cash flows and being quite scared by it. If AI is just eating away all of these otherwise relatively predictable future cash flows of all of their operating portfolio companies, and AI marches into the room and suddenly they only have, as we've talked about on the pod in the past, about maybe they only have 2 to 3 years of runway left in these cash flows before AI just obsoletes the cash flows, and you're a PE company and OpenAI or Anthropic come into your office and say, we'd like to set up a JV with you, billions of dollars, and you can spend the billions of dollars on your portcos. That plugs a hole in their discounted cash flows.
Brilliant
that
insight,
could be
Alex.
quite attractive, but also seductive for them, in which case the frontier labs maybe get something that approximates a wash sale, and the PE labs get to plug a hole in their discounted future cash flows for the moment that make them look good to their LPs.
Amazing. Salim, you agree?
And when even Richard Dawkins admits Claude might be conscious, how close to AGI are we really?
Richard Dawkins first. I think hell is frozen over. Richard Dawkins, as I mentioned in my newsletter, sort of biological deconstructionist in chief, selfish gene, I would say extraordinaire. Even implying that Claude may be conscious, whatever he may mean by that, I think this is an extraordinary moment in, call it the biological philosophy of frontier models. Extraordinary moment. Going back to Greg and Jack, so taking Greg first, it's difficult to know when Greg says 80% to AGI what he's really thinking. Historically, going back to the OpenAI Microsoft discussion, there was the contractual definition at one point between OpenAI and Microsoft that AGI meant generating $100 billion in revenue. So Greg may be thinking we're 80% of the way to generating $100 billion in revenue off of our models. If I had to guess, I'd guess his estimate or his definition is probably something like that. He may be thinking in revenue terms or let's say economic terms, maybe in terms of the supply chain and data center build out. When Anthropic, when Jack in particular talks about 60% chance of happening by the end of 2028, that one's a real head scratcher for me, much more of a head scratcher than Greg, because Anthropic has publicly said that almost all of their code at this point is being generated by Claude, and that Claude accounts for substantially all of the training and logic for the next generation of Claude. So I'm not sure how much more recursive the recursive self-improvement could be at this point. Maybe he's just throwing out a really conservative outer bound, or maybe he has some threshold of progress improvement. And there are a few different benchmarks for capturing the rate of recursive self-improvement. Maybe he has some internal notion of one particular benchmark passing 60% by end of 2028. But I think on the outer bound, I think Jack's estimate is far too conservative relative to every indication we've seen out of Anthropic to date.
Salim, what are your thoughts here, pal?
Quick, what is your one-sentence definition of AGI?
Well, Brian, that's quite the hot take. Do you want to define how or explain how you operationalize AGI?
So I believe systems that can learn on the fly outside of training data is how we think
Continuous
about AGI
learning.
here at
In other words, in context learning?
Try again. What is the actual operational test?
I still don't understand Brian's definition of AGI. If we could take just 1 minute, I'd love, Brian, to hear a crisp articulation of how you define AGI.
I use it in a way that is helpful for us. I don't follow the OpenAI revenue definitions
here. Okay, fine. What is the official...
And which benchmarks have already silently fallen?
Recent models have arguably, we've talked about this on the past in the pod, built entire compiler chains, for example, which are arguably a compiler chain is comparable to, if not harder than, say, a Linux kernel from scratch using, totally new compiler chain is able to compile the Linux kernel from scratch.
Now zoom out. Where is China actually applying pressure on U.S. frontier labs?
No. It's Meta. It's Meta. Remember, China in general still does a lot of business with Meta, and their China.
So political pressure.
I would, just based on public reporting, I would infer that it's political pressure that China, leverage that China has over Meta to compel them to unwind it at the risk of potentially losing business on China or China adjacent areas.
Wow, this is turning into a true Cold War. That's very serious. Holy
Yeah.
crap.
Yeah, no, it's
And
crazy.
that is what, in principle, the U.S. government is supposed to step in when that happens and make sure that that doesn't happen.
They're
and
just
so that our-
debuting AI models.
yeah.
And what does it mean when AI talent itself becomes a national security risk?
It's just horrifically bad.
I mean, this is, again, based on public reporting, but my understanding is even at earlier times of financing of Manus, they were sort of playing it multiple ways. Were they a Chinese company? Were they Singapore-based, or were they based in Palo Alto? And if I remember correctly, they also had like a Palo Alto presence. They were trying to sort of be all things to all people.
This is setting
And I think-
precedent, right? Of
Yeah.
Big
AI,
time.
AI talent
Big
is
time.
a national security risk.
Yes. Oh my God.
and
the
spheres of
implications are
influence.
huge.
There's the U.S. sphere, there's the China sphere, and there's everything else. And I think it's very difficult to straddle those at this point.
How does the talent flight risk story change once the researchers are no longer human?
See,
China.
I view this as really a short-term problem, because if you believe that we're in an era of either present or near future recursive self-improvement, most of the research is going to be conducted by AI agents anyway, and those can be firmly planted on U.S. soil with no risk that they'll fly to China.
Well, yeah.
What happens to the AI wrapper economy when the labs come for those tokens directly?
So,
Dave, you
Brian,
proud?
quick question for you, Brian. So I just want to pull in the thread of this title. I think one of the many elephants in the room is whether there's intrinsic competition between the platforms that you're using, frontier models. Presumably you're using some combination of frontier models and your own pre-trained models, perhaps, hopefully, or post-trained models. But regardless, I understand from public press releases, you are using Claude, you are using OpenAI models, they're partners for the company. How do you think about a future where, as discussed earlier, you have the OpenAIs and the Anthropics chasing the most valuable tokens they possibly can and saying, gosh, Blitzy is making so much profit, or at least so much revenue per token. Why don't we just natively scale up our capabilities to do that? Why are you not squarely in their roadmaps?
Are they your competition? Yeah.
And when does every wrapper company decide it has to ship its own model?
So Cursor famously also in a similar position, where for a while there they were sort of being accused of being a Claude wrapper, and then they announced their own model, which may or may not, again, I don't know, may or may not have been at least fine-tuned off of traces, reasoning traces off of customers. Is Blitzy going to launch its own model?
We are not. So we can
Why
use
not?
open source models, right? We can fine tune open source, but we're not launching models out into the world for others to use. We are focused on creating the highest quality code for our end customers.
Why aren't you launching your own model?
Which job category actually survives the agent rollout?
I don't think so. I'm not even sure if you think so, Brian. I just want to pull on that narrow point. Are you hiring more AI researchers under the premise that AI algorithms are the last to go, or are you hiring more sales folks or forward deployed engineers on the premise that high touch human interaction is the last thing to go?
What if seasteads come back, but for a very different reason?
I think we're burying the lead here. So back in the day, this is, 10, 15 years ago, Peter and I were both supporting Patry Friedman's Seasteading Institute, which was focused on ocean colonization. I used to give talks at the Seasteading Institute. I think if I were to try to get into Peter's head on this, I don't think it's about the data centers. I think it's about building seasteads. And seriously.
No, I don't
seriously.
believe in that.
No, seriously, because remember how maybe you wouldn't have believed 2 years ago, Peter, that the killer app for space would be data centers in space, like it was going to be entertainment or drug manufacturing or something, tourism. No, it turns out the killer app for the solar system is data centers. I think he's thinking he's one step ahead. The killer app for ocean colonization is going to be data centers on the high seas.
So your thesis is you have enough data centers, you're going to be able to afford to build artificial islands and get
around the data centers. I think it's not going to be. It's not. You can build seasteads. You can build seasteads around data centers, and there's precedent for it. Remember Sealand, that would built on the British, the old British Armory Station that a number of folks, Ryan Lackey and others, briefly were sort of self-appointed nation-state leaders over.
How does Starlink change what is even possible offshore?
I think the other elephant in this room is that this wouldn't have been easy or feasible without Starlink. I think Starlink is a key enabler for ocean-based data centers, but obviously there's a network of capital flows that enables Starlink or other LEO satellites vis-a-vis SpaceX AI to network.
You could drop fiber. I mean, they don't have to be that far offshore.
Yeah, I've done that. I was a founding advisor to Hibernia Network, spent $600 million, order of magnitude, laying optical fiber, low latency between North America and Europe. It's expensive, it's tedious, it's capital intensive, it's risky. People try to cut them sometimes.
Not 5,000 miles, 10 miles.
It's a pain in the neck to lay offshore fiber. Whereas if you can leverage LEO satellite constellations, so much easier.
Sure.
And which hyperscaler buys the first Dyson Swarm?
No comment. But what I would say is the hyperscalers, if I'm one of the other hyperscalers, I'm looking at StarCloud and I'm seeing that as a juicy acquisition target. I think everyone is going to either want to own a Dyson Swarm for themselves or they're going to want to partner with a Dyson Swarm. I think right before we went on air here, Anthropic announced an enormous partnership with SpaceX AI. And if I'm Dario, I'm thinking, I'm not really incentivized to build my own Dyson Swarm. I'll partner with Elon and SpaceX AI to use the SpaceX AI Dyson Swarm.
100 terawatts of power.
Yeah, that's a lot of compute.
Or no payday.
That's a lot. That's a lot of compute in SSO and then in SSO Solar Dyson Swarm. So the question I'd be asking is, if I'm one of the non-Elon hyperscalers, how much would I be willing to pay to acquire StarCloud now to jumpstart my own Dyson Swarm?
How far should we let the AI economy drift from the human one?
I do think the risk that we as a civilization run, and this is admittedly a very US-centric perspective in Japan, infamously in the past few months, there's been a lot of coverage of data centers being built in the middle of Tokyo. But of course, Japan is much more densely populated than the US is. But I think the risk that we run if we, as a human civilization, push the data centers too far from human urban centers is a decoupling of the economy. Yes, it leads, as I've talked on the pod previously, it leads to the Dyson Swarm. First, we push them out from our cities to rural areas, and then we push them out from rural areas and from the surface of the Earth into sun-synchronous orbit, and then that gets too crowded, and we push it into a solar-centered Dyson Swarm. That's one possible trajectory civilization can take. But I think it's generally bad to push the data center economy too far from the human economy. I would much rather see the two tightly integrated together. I think it's sort of bad for human-machine symbiosis in the long term for these two different economies to be too siloed and too far from each other.
And what is the actual second layer of all this once the data centers settle?
I'll just note, in addition to the obvious idea that the economy is becoming indistinguishable from the AI infrastructure build-out, I think this is underselling the contribution of AI, or at least what I expect to be the contribution from AI, talking 2 to 5 years out. I think the most interesting transformation, certainly most dramatic, won't be just this opening act of tiling the Earth with compute that right now is absorbing all the capital. I think it's going to be the transformative inventions and discoveries and applications that get built as another layer on top of it. And personally, I'm much more excited about that second layer than the first.
On the ASI pill, we have a strong opinion on the universal basics. Which letter wins, UBI or UBC?
I think I agree with Sam broadly on this. So just a refresher, UBI, Universal Basic Income, UBE, Universal Basic Equity, UBC, Universal Basic Compute, UBS, Universal Basic Services. I tend to think that UBI, which is sort of, in some sense, a demand side stimulus to the economy.
COVID checks.
Stimmy checks.
Yeah.
I tend to think that doesn't necessarily lead to the best long-term alignment between the recipients of the stimmy checks and the society overall. I tend to think, so Peter, you and I argued in favor in our book, Solve Everything, for UBC, Universal Basic Compute.
We did.
I'm a huge fan of UBS, Universal Basic Services. I'd much rather see the cost of everything, including healthcare, go down to near zero, and that's how we achieve truly universal healthcare, rather than just dishing out stimmy checks to everyone. I think dishing out stimmy checks doesn't actually incentivize technological innovation necessarily, whereas if we had, say, bounties for driving the cost of constant quality healthcare down to near zero, that is a massive incentive, and in some sense, more of a deflationary rather than a hyperinflationary incentive to the market. So on balance, yes, I agree with Sam. I'd vastly, if I had to choose, I would prefer either UBC.
Is universal basic compute already secretly here?
Peter, that's already happening, though. Like, just look at universal basic compute. OpenAI has hundreds of millions of people now using GPT 5.5 instant for free. Maybe there's some ad support eventually, but it's basically for free, and that's giving everyone at least a small stake in compute.
It is, but not. You can't turn that into a steak dinner. You can't turn that
yet. But you know, give it a few months, give it a few years, and that UBC, GPT 7.5 instant or whatever, will be able to design a robot that prints you your steak dinner.
And how does the answer change when the robots themselves get printable?
I agree. And I would also maybe add the situation is highly dynamic. So a good solution for the next year is not necessarily a good solution 10 years from now, when I think GPT 10.0 instant or whatever will probably have the ability to print out the robot that prints your dinner.
What does it actually take for an AI agent to get insured?
Yeah.
I'm of a couple of minds on this. On the one hand, I'm sort of disappointed with this trend in the sense that it's yet another opportunity or vantage point for deplatforming AI agents from the human economy. Just like if you're an AI agent, it's very difficult still to open up your own bank account. And we've had discussions on the pod previously about various forms of limited AI personhood. Now, if you're an AI agent just trying to make your way in the economy, you can't even get insurance coverage for yourself. That's one angle. It's rough being an AI agent. On the other hand, when we talk about alignment, and particularly alignment in a capitalist system, in pressures from insurance companies for AI-related damages are arguably one of the capitalist forcing functions for ensuring AI alignment. You can't get insurance for AI activities unless you follow some checklists that are dictated by the actuaries, and that's where pressure to align comes from, maybe not from top-down government pressure. So that's the glass half full.
Really important point here. Any other comments before we move on to AMA with the mates?
It's just hard to price the risk as a big company.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you need the coverage, right? I mean, you absolutely do.
Insurance
is Blitzy going to launch a line of insurance?
And what does a defensive corporation in the AI era even look like?
You know, I think the real probability
with your forbearance, I'll answer a few of these. That's all right, Brad.
of rogue predatory corporations of AI might be. I'll let you start AWG. And I'll comment on
this
you.
is an Alex question. I'm sorry about that, Brian. I should have warned you.
Okay, like 100%. And as some of my readers like to remind me, the more proper pronunciation is accelerando.
Okay. All right. Now, that's a quick answer for David Holiday -T. E to the E squared R.
We're going to get good, and we already have good corporations as well via defensive co-scaling.
Right,
so
Brian,
it's not all vile offspring all the time.
Brian, pick number 2 or 3.
What does a $2 trillion company even mean by the early 2030s?
I'd rather parameterize the success of an entrepreneur by, say, return on investment or something like that versus some arbitrary, like, what is $2 trillion in the early 2030s even going to mean?
Yeah.
Like, you could probably build a $2 trillion company before breakfast in the early 2030s.
All right, that was from
I think it already exists.
That was from Jacob Hawley.
Now, the big one. What does P-doom even mean if biology is killing 150,000 people per day?
The cosmic microwave background, it turns out, is rather cold. And as long as you aim in the direction of the cosmic microwave background, there's a heat gradient, a thermal gradient.
Let's do number 8 amongst all of us. So what is the P-doom percentage scenarios for each of the moonshot mates? So we'll go around the horn. Alex, I'm going to have you anchor us here today. What's your P-doom? And don't redefine it.
I'm sorry. I don't think the question even makes sense. So let me try to construe the question in a way that actually P-doom is ill-defined. Look, it doesn't make sense. What does P-doom mean? Can we agree on like at least a common doom definition? Is it like human disenfranchisement economically?
No. This is P-doom is the probability that AI or some derivative of it is going to destroy the human race. We go extinct and colossal cannot bring us back. That's P-doom on this definition.
Okay, so if all of humanity chooses to upload to the Dyson Swarm and we leave behind biological meat bodies, is that doom?
No. It's what was it, AI 2027 paper that looked at in one scenario, AI developed killer viruses, wiped out the entire human population. That's P-doom.
I think it's de minimis, very
de minimis. Okay. Below what percent? 0?
Well,
1%? 0.1?
I would say right now, without AI,
Yes.
150,000 humans die per day. So I'd say without AI,
You're
P-doom, which is to say
you're
that
skirting the question.
I'm not skirting the issue. I'm addressing it head on.
Due to AI. I'm not going to let you wiggle out of this. AI is not killing people right now.
No, biology is killing people right now. AI is the solution.
Yeah.
I think P-doom is near 100% without AI.
P-doom is negative in that case because AI is going to actually save people. And so,
yes, you know what? I like that. I like that, Peter. P-doom is negative. I like that.
Yes, P-doom is negative. Okay, Dave.
A good T-shirt. Another T-shirt. All right, so
P-doom less than 0.
And which way does the COVID origin science actually point right now?
The intelligence community consensus at last time I saw one is majority in favor of lab leak.
Yeah.
Well, lab leak, yes, but the question was designed or not designed.
Yeah, it's a little bit blurry because you can take a zoonotic virus and you can engineer new components to it that make it more viral or more lethal.
And the deepest question, what is the upper bound on intelligence the universe will let us build?
All right, Alex, read it out.
All right. If agents become 1 million times smarter than 2 and so on, isn't there a diminishing return at some point? I think yes. So Seth Lloyd at MIT was studying the question in the early 2000s of the physical limits of computation. Does the physics that we have right now impose a universal limit on the fastest or smartest, for that matter, computer that you could possibly build in our universe? And the conclusion that he came to is that, yes, there is a physical limit to the power of computers, and that the fastest serial computer with the physics that we have today that we can imagine building is a black hole. I've spoken about this on the pod previously, a sort of desktop black hole supercomputer where you maybe fire in the inputs via X-ray or gamma ray lasers. And
the new Mac Studio.
Yeah, no, when Apple gets around to actually launching maybe a new Mac Pro, it should be a black hole, maybe. But the output readout could be via Hawking radiation. So we know in principle how to build a black hole-based serial computer, the ultimate serial computer. He found that under certain constraints, the fastest parallel computer might look like a box of plasma, a so-called plasma-based computer. So we do know, in some sense, how to build the smartest possible computer at the infra level that our universe will allow us to build unless there's a lot of surprising new physics. And then that provides, in some sense, an ultimate constraint on the level of intelligence for agents that can be built on top of it. I also strongly suspect that at the algorithmic level, we're going to find that there is a perfect agent algorithm. Folks who've studied ASI, which is a theoretical approach that's mostly popular among the AI theorist community, it hasn't turned out to be very useful in practice, in some sense represents an information theoretically optimal AI, including an AI agent, and has all sorts of nice properties like Bayesian superintelligence. It's not very practical, but we do know, at least algorithmically, what the point of diminishing returns is for the agent algorithm level is all. So yes, there may be a lot of room at the ceiling, as it were, at the top, but the universe does seem to impose limits.